real, sustained economic growth or merely a flash in the pan? Hello, this is Business 7, and in this program we are going to dissect the latest economic growth figures, the official ones supplied by the Namibia Statistics Agency for the first quarter of 2022. Please stay tuned.
Connection. It's in the human touch, the feeling of belonging. It inspires us and empowers us, creates clarity from complexity. It starts new conversations, unlocks the power of advice, and makes an impact on your life. At Alex Forbes, we pioneer insight to provide you with advice that connects your decisions of today to your impact tomorrow.
Namibia's economy in the first quarter of this year grew by 5.3%. That is according to the official statistics by the Namibia Statistics Agency. Should we get excited or should we be slightly wary? We spoke to the economist of Simone Storm, Theo Klein.
Here to put the first quarter's growth figures into perspective for us, Simone Storm economist Theo Klein. Is always very, very welcome to you, Theo.
Thank you for having me once again, Jo-Marie.
You're becoming a regular here. We're going to have to start paying you. Theo.
For some,
yeah, it will come off a low base, I have to warn you. Theo, the Namibia Statistics Agency last week released the first quarter growth figures for 2022, and yes, 5.3%. Wow. But there are loads of factors to still take into account before we start opening the champagne bottles.
Yes. Yeah, I think, Jo-Marie, to be very honest, when I was at the media release, I was pleasantly surprised at the number. But I think obviously something to be positive about, but in a cautious way, in that, as you said, there's a lot more that needs to be done going forward. I think it was interesting to see that this is now the fourth consecutive quarter that we see an expansion, or rather positive growth. And interestingly, the first quarter of this year's 5.3% is the best first quarter since the first quarter of 2015. 2015 sort of being the big turning point in our economy, where government started doing their fiscal consolidation, starting to spend less, bring the debt under control, or at least trying to. And obviously, we've been really in an economic slump since then. So, that was quite an interesting trend or pattern to see in the data. But I think, yes, it is positive for the very short term, but there are a lot of challenges that remain. And if we look at the sectors that drove the 5.3% figure, being the mining sector that grew by 23%, that's not necessarily very comforting for us, in the sense that we are not sure whether, obviously, to achieve that 23% growth, the mining sector would not necessarily have increased a lot or created a lot of jobs. Obviously being a very capital intensive sector, it could very well be that they've increased production due to machinery and equipment and so forth. And I think, we don't have data on this, but it's just sort of our feeling for a lot of other sectors as well. How much of the growth that we see that supported this 5.3% growth in the first quarter, how much of that was driven by companies who invested in the last 2 years in technology, computer software programs, or equipment to replace individuals or human beings? And obviously through that, you have productivity gains where you can produce a lot more and show better sort of GDP growth figures, but your employment might not necessarily have improved at the same time. So, just with COVID alone, we have about 15,000 retrenchments that we need to replace in terms of creating new jobs for them. But like I said, we don't have data on this, but it remains concerning to know what has actually happened to employment. I think very exciting, and one thing to be positive about for the future, or for the very short term at least, is that the NSA, the National Statistics Agency, has indicated that they might start doing quarterly labor force surveys from next year onwards. So then on a quarterly basis, we might see updated figures on unemployment and so forth, to really see what's happening on the ground in terms of jobs.
Yes, Theo, that would be wonderful, a wonderful development, because especially in our economy, the recovery is so closely tied to employment and getting people back to earning a living. And without that data, we're simply lost. We're flying in the dark here. Getting back to the 5.3 and the best first quarter since 2015, I mean, it's wonderful, wonderful news. And then Russia looked for difficulty with Ukraine. So how is that, this whole international turmoil, the oil price volatility, etc., how's that going to affect growth going forward for the rest of the year?
Well, I think, Germany, we are sort of the view that the first quarter's 5.3% might be the best quarter that we see for 2022. And there are mainly two big reasons for that. The first reason is that the first quarter of last year contracted by 4.9%. So let's say 5% contraction, that's quite a lot. So the first quarter of this year was coming off a low base. And now the second, third, and fourth quarters of last year grew on average it ranged between 3% and 6% growth for those 3 quarters last year. So the second, third, and fourth quarter of this year will then be coming off a slightly higher base. And therefore we expect, the second, third, and fourth quarter of this year might show slower growth than the 5.3% we saw for the first quarter. Just for the layman to understand is that the contraction led to a GDP value of 32 billion for the first quarter last year. But the second, third, and fourth quarters ranged between 33 and 35 billion Namibian dollars. So, it's in Namibian dollar terms, it's a higher value that you need to now grow from to get a higher percentage growth. So from that statistical base effect, that's just mathematics. We do think that the first quarter of this year might then be our best quarter. The second reason why we think it will be our best quarter, besides from the mathematics, is that, as you said, the war in Ukraine broke out, but this happened 23, 24 February, so closer to the end of the first quarter. So the inflationary effects from the war in Ukraine would largely be captured from the second quarter onwards.
While Namibia and its cities are seen as one of the cleanest countries in Africa, plastic pollution is a big problem. Therefore, it's up to each of us to do what we can to reduce the use of plastic, especially single-use plastic bags. At Liberty Life Namibia, we've taken the decision to turn all our old branding items into reusable shopping bags. It's a way in which we can drive sustainability and look after our most important stakeholder, our environment. If you also believe in sustainability and would like more information, please get in touch. Liberty Life Namibia. In it with you.
It's not called the price monster for nothing. Why is inflation such a big threat to the Namibian economy and especially the consumer? Theo Klein, economist of Simone Storm, joins us again.
Why is inflation bad? inflation is bad in Namibia because we are not creating a lot of jobs. Salaries are not necessarily growing significantly. Even in the public sector, we know that public servants have not received a salary increase or inflation adjustment again this year. So, and I mean, that's quite a large proportion of our labor force. And then even in the private sector, you still hear of certain companies in various sectors implementing salary cuts till today. And with salary cuts that were put in place 2 years ago in lockdown are still to some extent in place at the moment. So salaries are not necessarily growing, but prices are growing. And people need to eat, people need to drive to work in their car or in a taxi and so forth. But, you know, so that higher fuel prices, higher food prices, higher logistics or transport costs, for example, your shipping costs for our imports, all those inflationary effects will obviously weigh heavily on household budgets, but also for corporates. So and that will lead to lower consumption spending. And why is consumption so important? I mean, last year, consumption was 75% of our GDP. But on average, consumption is 70% of our economy. So if anything leads to lower consumption spending, it's 70% of our economy that's underperforming or that's slowing down. So that's why it's so important. And then I haven't even talked about interest rates yet, Jo-Marie, because the first quarter saw only a 25 basis points hike, but the second quarter saw a 75 basis points hike, more than three times the hike of the first quarter. And we still expect another 100 basis points hike before the end of this year. So from your second quarter onwards, you had a lot higher interest rates to deal with. So indebted households and corporates would also be sitting with a lot higher monthly debt repayments from the second quarter onwards, which would also weigh on consumption spending. So all these inflationary effects would largely be captured in the data from the second quarter onwards. And I think that will then also weigh on growth. I mean, inflation is the #1 reason why a lot of global economists are forecasting recessions in the US, the UK, and the EU at the moment for the second half of this year. And I think we will not be spared from that. We will definitely also see some sort of slowdown in overall GDP growth as a result of less spending taking place. And like I said earlier, we are in the dark, sort of, as you said, with our employment figures. But I mean, to a great extent, we're expecting that to remain relatively flat. But then, yeah, some sectors could still show higher growth because of automation and so forth. But so I think those are the two big reasons, Jo-Marie, why we believe the first quarter could potentially be the best quarter that we see for this year. I mean, obviously we can be wrong, but that's just at least our view. And so, yeah, do we see GDP growth on a quarterly basis of 5% again for the rest of this year? Unlikely. Do we see between 3 and 4%? Maybe also a bit unlikely. I don't know. Based on my forecasts, we would be only growing between 2 and 3% every quarter, and then to reach our 2.5% annual forecast for 2022. So yeah, that's just sort of how we see it going forward for the rest of this year, at least.
Okay, well, let's cling to that 5.3% while we can, because yeah, it's going to be tough going forward. Theo, thank you very much for putting all of this into perspective for us, as always. And no doubt we will very soon contact you again. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for having me, Jo-Marie.
economic fragmentation. What a big word, but you'd better know what it's all about because it is the buzzword on the global scene at the moment. To clarify the term, we are going to play you this video by an economist of the International Monetary Fund. And that's all that we have for this week in Business 7. Please join us again next week. Until then, take care.
Economists have recently been sounding the alarm about the risks of fragmentation. But what exactly does it mean? When we talk about geo-economic fragmentation, we are referring to a world that could divide into economic blocs, whose member countries do business only with each other. This would fracture the existing flow of capital, goods, services, ideas, and technologies across borders. Why is this an issue? Well, over the past 40 years, these forces of integration have boosted productivity and living standards, tripling the size of the global economy and lifting 1.3 billion people out of extreme poverty. In short, they have transformed our world. But the successes of economic integration have been accompanied by increased domestic inequality. And the pandemic widened these gaps, especially as countries face supply chain disruptions, rising food and energy prices. Looking back, deep divergent forces were already at play before the pandemic. The rising power of emerging market economies, especially China, was a direct consequence of their integration into the world economy. Yet the rise in their economic might was not matched by a similar rise in their financial and global institutional firepower. Meanwhile, tensions over trade, technology standards, and security have been growing for many years. The war in Ukraine and the associated sanctions have brought to the surface these hidden fault lines between the underlying geopolitical tectonic plates. Faced with the risk of further disruptions and severe policy uncertainty, countries and multinational companies are quickly re-evaluating the shape of their global production structure. Some countries also responded by limiting exports of food like wheat or energy and other key commodities. In total, around 30 countries have imposed such trade restrictions. More gradual but profound tectonic shifts also threaten to weaken the international monetary system. The dollar is by far the dominant currency for global reserves and payment systems, and will definitely remain so in the near future. But with the financial sanctions on Russia, especially on the foreign exchange reserves of the Central Bank of Russia, the possibility of future restrictions imposed by the US government may lead some countries to move away from dollar reserves, now seen as less desirable. If this trend towards disintegration continues, what are the potential costs? Well, first, according to IMF research, technological fragmentation alone can lead to losses of up to 5% of GDP for most countries. There are multiple channels, but an important one is that technological innovation needs scale, and the fragmented world is a smaller and less innovative world. Less trade could also push up inflation, eliminate jobs, and deprive people of food, medicine, and other essentials. Said differently, further fragmentation would represent yet another supply shock, leading to more inflation and less output. This would be on top of the two supply shocks we have just experienced with the pandemic and the war. Bringing production back home and moving away from international supply chains would not only make things more expensive, it would also increase risks, with countries putting all their eggs in one basket. But we need not end up there. While there is a legitimate need to build a more resilient and more just economic system, we should still strive to keep our economies interconnected. This will allow us to work together on shared global priorities like raising living standards worldwide, while reducing inequality both within and across countries. It will also allow us to jointly tackle enormous common challenges, such as climate change or future pandemics. After all, CO2 emissions and viruses know no borders. Finally, as emerging economies become ever more affluent, we need to find ways to increase their representation in our global institutions. An integrated world will succeed with shared prosperity and governance.
Connection. It's in the human touch, the feeling of belonging. It inspires us and empowers us, creates clarity from complexity. It starts new conversations, unlocks the power of advice, and makes an impact on your life. At Alex Forbes, we pioneer insight to provide you with advice that connects your decisions of today to your impact tomorrow.
While Namibia and its cities are seen as one of the cleanest countries in Africa, plastic pollution is a big problem. Therefore, it's up to each of us to do what we can to reduce the use of plastic, especially single-use plastic bags. At Liberty Life Namibia, we've taken the decision to turn all our old branding items into reusable shopping bags. It's a way in which we can drive sustainability and look after our most important stakeholder, our environment. If you also believe in sustainability and would like more information, please get in touch. Liberty Life Namibia. In it with you.
In Business 7, you get news on current economic, financial, and business matters in Namibia. The weekly show features interviews with experts and in-depth analysis of burning issues in a way that caters for ordinary Namibians and business connoisseurs alike. We crunch the numbers that matter, decipher statistics that shape Namibian lives, discuss smart money, and explore the impact of global development locally. Money makes the world go round, so catch us on NTV, OneUp2.com, and the Facebook platforms of the Namibian Sun, Republikane, Algemeine Zeitung, and Namibia Media Holdings. For news related or advertising queries, please contact B7 at synergy.com.na.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, welcome to another exciting edition.